Our story begins in a dark forest where Prince Cheon Yo-woon is running from someone or something. As he climbs a mountain, he stumbles and falls all the way to the ground. He curses to himself before getting back up. The prince looks up at the trees and sees masked men in red robes. He curses again, realizing all the running he did to get away only led him back toward the masked men. The men begin to mock him as he struggles to figure out what to do. Without enough strength to run away again, he stands there contemplating. He questions why they want to kill him so badly, as he already gave up on enrolling into the academy. The masked men explain that his bloodline, as the king's descendant, still poses a threat to the throne, which is why they must kill him. The men mock him further, insulting his deceased mother. This angers the prince, and he draws his blade. Knowing he is likely going to die, he decides he might as well go out fighting. The leader of the masked men commands them to attack, and they rush the prince. Prince Cheon swings his blade but misses entirely. One of the men quickly disarms him by knocking the knife out of his hand and grabs him by the throat, strangling him. The prince struggles to breathe, but unexpectedly pulls another knife from behind him, managing to stab and kill the man strangling him. The man falls to the ground, shocking the others, who cannot believe that someone with no martial arts training managed to kill a trained warrior. The death of their comrade enrages the masked men even more. One of them delivers a flying knee to the prince's face, knocking him down. Another pulls a blade and stabs the prince in the stomach, leaving him writhing in pain. As the prince begins to bleed out, the men laugh and mock him, but they are interrupted by an explosion. The explosion shocks the men as they see one of their group lying on the ground with half of his body blown off. They turn to see a boy standing behind them, emanating a deep blue aura. The masked men charge at the boy, but before they can react, he swiftly kills one of them, reducing him to pieces just like the first. One by one, the blue aura warrior eliminates the men. One of the masked men tries to escape, but the aura-clad boy swiftly ends him as well. The prince, still lying on the ground and bleeding, watches the scene unfold, smiling faintly as he enjoys the spectacle. His vision begins to fade, and he starts losing consciousness. The prince's eyes snap open again as he sees the silhouette of the blue aura warrior standing over him. The figure steps closer, revealing himself to be someone from the prince's bloodline, a future ancestor who traveled back in time. The ancestor checks his watch, realizing there is little time left. The ancestor kneels beside the prince and pulls out a syringe. As the prince teeters on the edge of unconsciousness, the ancestor injects him with the syringe. The prince lies there, trying to process what is happening as his ancestor disappears in a flash. Before fading away, the ancestor mentions something about the Nano machine being the latest version. The prince, barely clinging to life, tries to understand his words. Suddenly, a strange voice echoes in his mind, and a system window appears before him displaying serial number 034-4532-5893 initialized. The prince is left in shock, realizing there is now a strange voice inside his head. The voice continues, explaining that a long time ago, fighters of Jianghu learned martial arts to protect themselves against enemies. Over time, martial arts evolved from a method of self-defense into a tool for killing. It grew more sophisticated and complex as simple forms developed into intricate series of movements, and breathing techniques became fundamental to mastering internal energy. Martial artists passed on their teachings and heirlooms to future generations, allowing martial arts to continue evolving. Those who mastered martial arts became far more powerful than regular humans and were soon called the Morim people. Fighters who aspired to be disciples of the Morim people gathered to form clans. These clans divided into two factions, the forces of justice and the forces of evil. Between the delicate balance of these two groups, another faction emerged, one that pursued an entirely different path, seeking strength above all else. The world called them the demonic cult. Among them was the illegitimate child of the highest-ranking family in the demonic cult, a child who had the right to the throne. This is the story of Cheon Yo-woon. Cheon Yo-woon wakes up, wondering how he is still alive, as he was certain he had been pierced by a sword. He notices sweat covering his body and black spots scattered across his skin. Suddenly, the voice speaks again, asking if he is awake. Startled, the prince wonders where the voice is coming from. Realizing the voice might be in his head, he hesitates, but the voice confirms his suspicion. The prince asks who the voice is, and it replies that it was created for one sole purpose: to assist him. The voice introduces itself as Sky Corporation's 7th-generation Nano machine. The scene shifts to Mr. Jang and Dr. Beck. Dr. Beck asks if it was an assassination attempt, to which Mr. Jang confirms, mentioning that there have been many attempts on the prince recently. He adds that he didn't think they would send him directly there. Dr. Beck responds, stating that of course it would have to be their first-class Mr. Jang, and it was the only option they had. Dr. Beck thinks to himself that it is a miracle Prince Cheon-Yo-woon made it out alive. Mr. Jang remarks that he believes someone helped the prince, though he can't tell who it was. Dr. Bayek asks if he couldn't have guessed who helped the prince based on the markings, prompting Mr. Jang to recall what he saw when he found the prince. He describes the scene as terrible, with corpses of men from the demonic cult lying on the cold ground, many without their upper bodies. Among them was one man whose upper body was intact, but the dagger Mr. Jang had given the prince as a gift was embedded in his head. He found the prince covered in blood, but surprisingly, without any wounds. Dr. Bayek agrees, noting that the prince's breathing was as if he were sound asleep. They continue talking as they make their way to the prince's room. The scene shifts to the prince. He asks Nano if it was the one that saved him from the enemies. Nano replies that it did not save him from the enemies, but it did put his body into self-healing mode. The prince asks what self-healing mode means. Nano explains that it involves sending basic information to the prince's brain and requests his permission to transmit the basic information and manual. The prince agrees. After accepting, a blue aura surrounds the prince, and he feels as if he is about to vomit. Moments later, he does. Nano reassures him that this is a natural reaction when receiving information for the first time and that he will not feel dizzy or nauseous starting the second time. The prince asks if it is true that thousands of nano machines are now embedded in his body. Nano confirms, stating that 6,482,040,000 nano machines have been placed within him. The prince then asks if Nano can be forcefully removed from his body. Nano explains that it is programmed to self-destruct only upon the prince's death. Before the prince can ask more questions, Mr. Jang knocks on the door. The prince panics and tells Nano to stay quiet, worrying that others might think he is talking to himself. Nano assures him that they can communicate via his thoughts. Mr. Jang enters, only to be stopped by the terrible smell coming from the prince. Dr. Bayek asks to check the prince's pulse. The prince obliges, and Dr. Bayek holds his hand, shocked by what he discovers. Mr. Jang asks what happened, and Dr. Bayek explains that the prince's body has been cleansed of impurities and his energy flow has been activated. He adds that the prince now has the perfect body for learning martial arts. The prince asks Nano if this was its doing. Nano confirms, explaining that the nano machines removed waste from his body and reshaped his blood vessels, joints, and muscles to best suit his body shape. The prince reflects on the demonic cult, recalling its structure of clans and families. He remembers that the Lord is bound by an oath to marry a woman from each of the 6 main clans to produce heirs. These descendants are raised within their respective clans until they reach a certain age and are admitted to the demonic academy, which opens every 10 years. He recalls that the academy is headed by leading experts from the magistrate and was established to train the best warriors of each generation. Periods of intense competition among princes at the academy were referred to as the Battle of the Heirs by the magistrates. The prince remembers that Dr. Bayek is from the Poison clan and decides he must hide the presence of Nano. Nano assures him that no technology of this era can detect its presence. Dr. Bayek concludes that someone must have helped the prince, but notes there is nothing wrong with his body. He prescribes a tonic to help the prince regain energy. After Dr. Bayek leaves, he ponders how someone with a weak body and no martial arts knowledge could now have a perfect body for learning martial arts. He realizes the prince could potentially surpass other descendants of the demonic cult lord. The prince reflects on how Mr. Jang saved his life. Though Nano healed him, he knows he would have died without Mr. Jang's intervention. He tries to thank Mr. Jang, but Mr. Jang deflects, suggesting the prince take a bath first due to the smell. While bathing, the prince asks Nano how much his body can heal in self-healing mode. Nano explains that internal and external wounds from external impacts can heal quickly, but severe injuries like blood loss or decapitation require more time due to cell division. The prince decides to test this by slicing his hand with a knife. Nano activates self-healing mode and the wound heals quickly. The prince notices his body has become more muscular and asks Nano if it was responsible. Nano confirms, explaining that while it is scientifically impossible to create matter from nothing, it is possible to reconstruct the body's existing parts. After bathing, the prince begins his study time. Following Nano's instructions, he reads a book on blood points. Once finished, Nano scans the book and transmits the information to the prince's brain. The prince experiences the blue aura again, but does not vomit this time. Nano assures him he will adapt to the process. The prince realizes he fully understands the information and sees this as a tremendous advantage for learning martial arts. Determined, he swears to surpass everyone else in the academy. The scene shifts to Prince Mukwem inquiring about how 5 men sent to kill one person ended up dead. A man in a red robe tells him he believes someone secretly helped the prince. Enraged, Prince Mukwem shouts, demanding to know who gave the man the right to call him by his name. The man quickly apologizes. Prince Mukwem clenches his fists, remarking that as a bastard of low blood, the prince should have been easy to kill. Determined, he declares that he will personally kill the prince at the demonic academy. The scene then shifts back to the prince, who is lying in bed. He reflects on how he couldn't sleep because of his nervousness. He looks out the window, wondering if it's morning yet, and ponders how the day has finally come for him to join the academy. As he gazes outside, he notices Mr. Jang training with his sword. The prince is shocked by the speed and power of Mr. Jang's movements. He thinks about how it would have been better if he had learned Mr. Jang's dagger techniques, but concludes that if he had done so, the 6 clans wouldn't leave him alone. He remembers the oath he made after his mother passed away, not to learn martial arts until he was admitted to the demonic academy. Nano then calls out to the prince, startling him. Nano asks if he would like to scan Mr. Jang's movements. Shocked, the prince asks if Nano can really scan the movements of others. Nano confirms, explaining that it can record Mr. Jang's martial arts training and transfer it directly into the prince's brain. Nano even offers to begin the transfer immediately. The prince hesitates, contemplating whether it's ethical to use Mr. Jang's techniques without permission. However, he decides that since he is about to attend the academy, he cannot afford any regrets. With resolve, he gives Nano permission to start scanning. Nano begins recording Mr. Jang's movements, which grow faster and faster as the scan progresses. For 30 minutes, the prince observes and scans until Nano informs him the process is complete. Nano then transfers the data to the prince's brain. After the transfer, the prince collapses to the ground, groaning that the pain was at least more bearable than yesterday's. He looks down in shock, marveling that he now has all of Mr. Jang's movements memorized. Curious, he picks up a sword and unsheathes it, wondering if he can now perform Mr. Jang's dagger techniques. Shutting the window, he takes a martial arts stance. His aura glows a calm blue, and his eyes blaze bright as he shatters a teapot into pieces with just 3 moves. The prince is amazed that he has performed techniques that took Mr. Jang 20 years to master. Nano chimes in, explaining that while the moves were successfully executed, the prince's muscles have not been conditioned for them. Nano suggests transferring muscle analysis to familiarize the prince's body with the techniques. The prince begins to consider the offer, but suddenly falls to the ground as his muscles feel like they are tearing apart. He asks Nano why he is in so much pain. Nano explains that repetitive training builds muscles suited for specific movements. But since the prince's body hasn't undergone such training, his muscles are not adapted. Nano proposes running a muscle simulation to prepare his body for the techniques, ensuring he can use them without pain. The prince asks if the transfer will completely eliminate the discomfort. Nano confirms and explains that the process will utilize every nano machine in his body, requiring a few hours to complete. The prince, realizing he has some time before leaving for the academy, permits Nano to begin the transfer. Nano informs him that he will be under anesthesia during the procedure. Concerned, the prince asks if the process will hurt. Nano reveals that there have been cases of fainting caused by the muscle transfer. Nervously, the prince decides to try it without anesthesia, requesting Nano to switch to it if the pain becomes unbearable. As the transfer begins, the prince's body glows light blue. At first, he feels only a light tickle, but seconds later, his body is engulfed in excruciating pain, as if on fire. He screams in agony until Nano injects the anesthesia, causing him to collapse into unconsciousness. The scene shifts to Mr. Jang in the kitchen. He takes a sip of the soup he's made, boasting that it's the best he's ever cooked. While cutting cabbage, he wonders what he should prepare for the prince today. He reflects on the 5 years he has spent cooking for the prince, recalling a memory of the prince's sick mother asking him to take care of her son. Realizing he hasn't seen the prince in hours, Mr. Jang grows worried and begins searching for him. He barges into the prince's room and finds him passed out on the bed. Checking the prince's pulse, he wonders what could have caused him to collapse. Glancing around, Mr. Jang notices footprints on the ground and realizes the prince was practicing his blade techniques. A proud smile spreads across Mr. Jang's face, as though he were a father beaming at his son's progress. The prince snaps awake as Nano informs him that the muscle and fiber transfer has been completed. He jolts upright, panting, and jokingly states that he is never doing that again. Nano replies that he had warned the prince beforehand. The prince wonders why he is lying on his bed and assumes it might have been Guar Jang who moved him. The prince picks up a dagger and asks Nano if it will hurt to use the dagger technique again. Nano responds, stating that due to the muscle transfer, the prince now has the same physical conditioning as someone who has practiced the dagger technique for 20 years. The prince closes his eyes, focusing, and aims his blade. He then thrusts the blade forward, emanating a yellow aura. The prince continues executing the movements, noting that while these are the same techniques as before, they now carry greater power and precision. He slashes through the air with incredible speed and transitions into the second formation of the dagger technique. As he stomps his foot on the ground to prepare for the next move, he suddenly stops, noticing a large hole in the floorboard. The prince frets, realizing that if Guar Jang sees this, he might get angry. Just then, Guar Jang calls out, announcing that breakfast is ready. The prince panics, attempting to cover the hole as best as he can. Guard Jang enters the room calling for the prince. Trying to distract him, the prince talks about how hungry he is. Guard Jang asks why the prince isn't sitting in his usual spot by the window. Stammering, the prince tries to come up with an excuse while forcing a nervous smile. He then notices that Guard Jang has made his favorite meal, stir-fried roast pork with a fried egg on top. The prince becomes a bit emotional, realizing this will be the last time he eats Guar Jang's cooking before leaving for the demonic academy. The prince quickly devours the meal as Guar Jang watches. Concerned, Guar Jang tells him to slow down or risk indigestion. Once finished, the prince sets his chopsticks down, only for Guar Jang to ask when he learned the dagger technique. Shocked, the prince tries to feign ignorance, asking what Guar Jang is talking about. However, Guar Jang moves the table, revealing the massive hole left by the prince's attempt at the second formation. The prince panics, knowing that stealing martial arts techniques is taboo in Murim. He realizes he has committed a grave offense by copying Guar Jang's technique. To the prince's surprise, Guar Jang praises him, saying he did well. He dismissively remarks that it doesn't matter if the prince stole the technique, as Guar Jang is his guardian after all. He adds that he would have taught the prince the technique long ago if it weren't for the oath the prince had made. Guar Jang then pulls out a piece of paper. When the prince asks about it, Guar Jang explains that it contains an energy flow method for the Nagong of the dagger technique. He tells the prince that while he could provide more tips, the academy will teach him far better than anything he could offer. The prince takes the paper and begins to cry. He recalls the day his mother died and the oath he made while hugging her lifeless body, that he would never cry again. As Guardiang leaves the room, he tells the prince that he will no longer be with him at the demonic academy. However, he assures the prince that it's okay to cry today, but from now on, he must grow stronger. The prince continues crying as Guardiang walks away. After a moment, Guardiang closes the door and the prince wipes his tears. Now more determined than ever, the prince vows to grow stronger so he can protect those he loves. The scene transitions to a large building where a crowd has gathered. A man steps out onto the balcony, surveying the people below. He sneers, remarking that they show no spirit and calling them fools. His deep red aura flares as it is revealed that this man is Li Huamyung, the left guardian of the king of the demonic cult. Li Huamyung notices the children in the front row, who are revealed to be the 6 heirs to the demonic cult: Cheon Mu Yeon of the Dark Clan, Cheon Kyung Woon of the Sword Clan, Cheon Mu Kyum of the Spring Clan, Cheon Jong Sum of the Poison Clan, Cheon Yu Chan of the Blade Clan, and Cheon Won Ryu of the Sound Clan. However, Li Huamyung pauses, realizing that Prince Cheon Yo Woon is not present.